So it's now my honor to introduce a one-woman army. Distinguished fellow at the Tikva Fund, the formidable Ruth Wisse. Looking at this petite, gray-haired grandmother, you may be thinking, can that description be accurate? Well, someone once called Ruth Wisse worth a battalion. I'd add she is the most fearsome warrior in any battalion. Let me just share a little bit about her. Ruth was born in Cernovic, a city in Romania at that time, which is now part of the Ukraine. Her family immigrated to Canada, and it was in Montreal that Ruth grew up. Yiddish was spoken in her home. Indeed, her mother ran a salon for many Yiddish-speaking poets and writers in Montreal. So when the great Yiddish poet, Avram Sutzkever, turned up in the city, Ruth then, a very young woman, was engaged to set up his lectures and his appearances around town. When he asked what was she planning to do with her life, Ruth responded proudly, teach English literature. Sutzkever asked, why not Yiddish literature? Ruth was dumbfounded. She thought that would mean a lifetime chained to Sholem Aleichem at the expense of William Shakespeare. But the more she thought about it, the more she thought and recognized that Sutzkever was exactly right. What the world needed more than another great English literature professor was someone who would bring to light the wisdom, the pleasure, the great learning of Yiddish literature, an art form that had come to full flower by the mid-19th century, but in one way or another had been buried for many, many years. Ruth's purpose in life became unearthing that wisdom. She was an archaeologist. She didn't want to let the language die. She wanted to dedicate herself to something that touched her heart and soul, and hopefully over time, touched ours. This 1,000-year language that was orphaned without a geographical homeland, and yet many of its greatest writers were as consequential as the modern writers. We just didn't know many of those Yiddish writers and didn't understand what they were trying to tell us. And so she decided at a very young age to risk her career in pioneering Yiddish literature as a subject of higher education. She first taught at her alma mater, McGill, in Montreal, and later she was named the Martin Peretz Professor of Yiddish Literature and Professor of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. She was a master teacher from the very beginning and had the rare ability, as you'll see soon, to hold spellbound a lecture hall of 400 as easily as a seminar room of 15. But Ruth is not only a pioneer in reviving the Yiddish literature, she's also a warrior for the Jewish people as a whole, for the state of Israel, taking up arms against anti-Semitism on college campuses, staunchly advocating liberal education in the humanities. She stands on the barricades for what she believes, because she does believe everything is at stake. And if I had to, and I will, end this introduction with one statement about Ruth, I'd say, Hazak, Hazak, Hazak. May God give her the strength to prevail for many more years. I will now call the class to order. Professor Ruth Wisse.
No pressure. Right. I don't see myself in any of that, obviously, but I owe so much to Roger, to Eric, to Elana, to everybody in the Tikva family, and to everybody here, I feel is part of this project. So Eric has given us clarity and direction, which is the equivalent, one might say, of halacha in our tradition. And now it's story time, the imaginative, suggestive counterpart of Agadah. I'm often asked how come a teacher of Yiddish literature thinks that she may have something important to say about politics, and I reply that Yiddish and Jewish literature is exactly what directed me to politics. Most of what I've learned about politics, I learned from literature, and I'd like to share just a very little of what I mean by that, touching on 3 works that are themselves part of the transformation of modern Jewish politics. As it happens, they were all written in the very same period, 1932, 33, 34, in Russian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. Those were very fateful years in history and in Jewish history in particular, and it stands to reason that great writers should have confronted the political dangers that we faced as a people. So the references, as you know, are included in the sheets that were so kindly provided, just in case you want to check them out. Isaac Babel, born near Odessa in 1894, was one of the most daring Jewish writers who ever lived, and he paid dearly for his boldness. In 1939, Joseph Stalin, the dictatorial ruler of the Soviet Union, had him imprisoned and tortured. We now know that he was executed without trial on January 27, 1940. Babel was shot because he was important. He had written one of the masterpieces of Soviet literature, a series of short stories collected under the title Red Cavalry that follows the events of the Russian-Polish War of 1920. That war was the Soviet government's first foreign offensive, a war it lost, and that its leaders were very eager to forget. Babel had been attached to the 1st Cavalry Army as a journalist, which meant that he was embedded in the Red Army as a Soviet propagandist. But once the war was over, he wrote a series of stories based on his diaries that tried to get at the complicated realities of that war. The new communist government was trying to impose its rule through the army. The fighters were Cossacks, horsemen, in what proved to be the last cavalry war. Jews were on both sides of the war, a few, like Babel, in Soviet uniform, but mostly by the thousands as residents of the towns that were being ransacked by both armies. To be a Jewish intellectual in that war was to be at one of the most complicated crossroads of modernity. When the stories were published in book form in 1926, their brilliance was unmistakable. The book went through 8 editions in Russian and was translated into all the major languages of Europe. In the words of one critic, Red Cavalry immediately turned Babel into an international literary figure and made him into one of the foremost Soviet writers. Now, I would like to single out just one of the stories of Red Cavalry, a story called Argamak, that Babel wrote in 1932, the concluding story of the 2nd and final edition of those stories. It describes an incident late in the war when the Soviet army is already in retreat. Lutov, the narrator, who is Isaac Babel's stand-in, had been traveling with the men for many months, and he's been writing letters home for many of them because most of them are illiterate. But so far, he's been unable to win their trust, and at this point, in order to prove himself, he asks to be transferred to the front lines. The division commander doesn't like the idea, but Lutov insists, and so he is assigned to the squadron of Commander Baulen, a factory worker, of whom he writes, "In his 22 years, Baulen had let nothing ruffle him. This quality, found in thousands of Baulens, proved an important element in the victory of the revolution. Baulen was hard, taciturn, and headstrong. The path of his life had been decided. He had no doubts about the rightness of his path. Deprivation came easy to him. He could sleep standing up. He slept pressing one arm against the other, and when he woke, his path from oblivion to full alertness was seamless. One could expect no mercy under Baulen's command." So our Jewish narrator feels very lucky when Baulen assigns him for the first time his own horse, which was, of course, the most precious item in a cavalry war, and at this point already in short supply. The horse that Baulen assigns him, Argamak, had belonged to the Cossack Pashka Tikhomolov. This Pashka had captured 2 Polish officers, and he was supposed to bring them in for questioning, but he shot them instead. As punishment, Baulen took away his horse and sent him to the transport carts, which was a humiliating demotion. Argamak turns out to be a gift horse in the Homeric sense of the word, one that carries the enemy inside him, because Pashka had trained this animal in a special Cossack trot that would be hard for any other horseman to master, much less someone with Lutov's limited experience. "I shook like a sack on the stallion's long, dry spine. I rode his back to pieces. Sores appeared on it. Metallic flies preyed upon these sores. Argamak grew thin. His eyes filled with the fire that one sees in tortured horses, the fire of hysteria and obstinacy. He no longer let me saddle him." "You've liquidated that horse, Four Eyes," Baulen says to Lutov. Instead of winning the trust of these men, Lutov's involuntary mistreatment of this animal earns him their anger and his commander's contempt. Now, soon after, the disgraced Pashka Tikhomolov redeems himself with stunning courage. In the battle for Rovno, he turns the transport carts into a fort, finds a machine gun, this is what entrepreneurship is about, and mows down the Poles, winning back the city for the Soviet side. Then he turns up at his old unit, having clearly earned back the right to his horse. When Argamak sees his master, he stretches out his neck and neighs in greeting. It's hard to know which of these two is in worse conditions or happier to be reunited. Watching this scene between Pashka and his horse, Lutov just wants to get out of the way. "I'm glad the horse is going back to you," he says to Pashka. "I can't handle him. Let's make peace." "It's not Easter yet for people to make peace," says Baulen, the commander, and Pashka is not ready for peace either. He turns his back on Lutov and leads the horse away. Lutov is alone among these men whose friendship I had not managed to win. He appeals to Baulen, his commander. "Why did you saddle me with an enemy? None of this is my fault." The squadron commander raised his head. "I can see right through you," he said, "right through you. All you want is to live without enemies. You'll do anything not to have enemies." Now, we're not told how Lutov reacted to this charge, but I know how I reacted. It went through me like a bayonet. I thought, he's right. That's true. Jews would do anything not to have enemies. We are the innocents of history, and we want to stay that way. None of this is our fault. Well, what is wrong with that? We probably agree, just on the basis of what I've said here, that none of what happened was Lutov's fault, that he would have gone to any lengths to avoid antagonizing Pashka or hurting the horse. Why is that wrong? Well, it is wrong here because Lutov has enemies. He has nothing but enemies. He is at war against the Poles as a soldier of the Soviet state, and as a Jew, he confronts enmity from within the ranks. The commander punishes Pashka for disobeying orders, but he punishes Lutov for wanting to stay harmless. No one can remain blameless under these new conditions. The blameless Jews of Rovno are being massacred by the Poles on one side and by the revolution on the other. If Lutov wants respect, he is going to have to learn to confront the enemy that he would rather not have. Babel marvelously dramatizes the dilemma of the Jew, who is now a political actor in history rather than the spectator, victim, martyr, scapegoat, idealist, and sufferer. Whatever Jews were doing in history won't work anymore. To want to have no enemies is not the equivalent of morality. And under certain conditions, when you do have enemies, it may even be the antithesis of morality. Lutov, of course, doesn't need to turn into a Cossack, but if he does not want to be massacred like the shtetl Jews, he will have to assume responsibility for the realities of enmity and war. Thus, Babel in 1932. Now, about the same time that Babel was rethinking Jewish morality in the Soviet Union, Isaac Bashevis Singer was writing his first novel in neighboring Warsaw. Although the two men were geographically not very far apart, and Singer was actually 8 years younger, they were culturally separated by what felt like generations. Babel was raised in cosmopolitan Odessa, and as we've seen, he rode with the Bolshevik Revolution. Bashevis Singer was the son of a rabbi and a rabbi's daughter. He wore his payas, his sidelocks, until his early 20s, and spent the First World War in a traditional Polish shtetl with his mother's family. Only then did he start living like a secular Jew as a member of Warsaw's large Jewish literary community, writing in Yiddish, his native language and the language of most Polish Jews. He situated his first novel, Satan in Gore, back in the 17th century and incorporated in it a tremendous amount of Jewish folklore, as if it were a traditional morality tale. But not surprisingly, he too begins his novel in wartime. Satan in Gore begins with the war that the Ukrainians still consider to this day, their war of independence, but Jews call it the Khmelnytsky massacres of Tach v'Tat, the Hebrew letters designating 1648, 1649 on the Gregorian calendar. Jews in Poland in the 17th century were protected wards of the Polish nobility. When the Haidamach peasants rose up against the Polish overlords, they massacred the unarmed Jews who stood in their way. Writing from a Jewish perspective, Bashevis Singer is clear about the relationship of evil to innocence. There is no equivocation. There's no ambiguity there. In the year 1648, the wicked Ukrainian hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky and his followers besieged the city of Zamość but could not take it because it was strongly fortified. The rebelling peasants moved on to spread havoc in Tomashov, Bilgorod, Krashnik, Turbin, Frampol, and in Gore too, the town that lay in the midst of the hills at the end of the world. They slaughtered on every hand, flayed men lulive, murdered small children, violated women, and afterward ripped open their bellies and sewed cats inside. Many Jews fled to Lublin. Many underwent baptism or were sold into slavery. Gore, which once had been known for its scholars and men of accomplishment, was completely deserted. Singer, however, is not interested in the Churban, in this Holocaust, which is the same word that Yiddish uses for the Holocaust of the Second World War. He's not interested in that. He's interested in what the Jews do in its aftermath. Though he was not like Babel, a Soviet soldier, he too is more interested in Jewish agency than in Jewish victimhood. So he focuses on the trickle of survivors who return to their town to pick up the shards of their former life. Happily, among the survivors is Rabbi Benish Ashkenazi, a learned and honorable religious leader who knows how important it is to maintain religious discipline, to fight demoralization by returning to the civilizing Jewish customs and laws. But Rabbi Benish finds it impossible to reimpose the old way of life, even among his own children and their families. And then one day, a rumor begins to circulate that a Messiah has arisen in the east, in Turkey, and that the Jews are about to be redeemed. Now, Jewish folk belief had held that the Messiah would come when people had achieved either perfect goodness or perfect evil. And the Khmelnytsky slaughters seemed to qualify for the apocalyptic wars of Gog and Magog. The conviction takes hold that a new age is near. Emissaries turn up from out of town to let the people know the great news that wonders and miracles are happening in Jerusalem. In Israel, a column of fire has been stretching from earth to heaven. The full name of God and Shabtai Tzvi are scratched on it in black. Now, Shabtai Tzvi was, of course, a historical figure, and Singer is building here fiction on the historical facts. People claimed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, and the rumor became a movement. One can see that even in the days before social media, the spread of fake news could electrify a population. People believe what they want to believe and what they need to believe. And Bashevis uses this prerogative of fiction to show us how this news of redemption affected a fictional town in faraway Poland. Gore is swept away by this expectation of messianic coming. A long-standing opponent of Rabbi Benish incites the town not to let this conservative authority stand in the way of salvation. Benish knows that this emerging movement is dangerous, false. He tries his best to stop it, but he is denounced as a heretic for standing in its way. So the rabbi is denounced as an apostate for denying the Messiah, and by the end of part 1, he is driven out of town. Now, there was a lot going on at the time that Singer was writing this story. He began writing it when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany and Nazism was powering up as a mass movement. Jewish youth in Poland was swept up by news of the great Soviet experiment, and Singer's own common-law wife was one of the communist idealists who crossed the Russian border to join that great progressive cause. Traditional Jewish authority was losing its hold over thousands of youngsters. And Singer was not a believer in humanism. He thought that without orthodoxy, there would be nothing to restrain the human appetites. A writer has to write about what he knows with the material he has at hand. And Singer used this material of traditional Polish Jewry to present a world classic study of mass hysteria. So in part 2 of the novel, as Shabtai Tzvi's follower, Reb Gedalia, takes over from Rab Benish in the town, life becomes much more pleasant, because he says yes to Rabbi Benish's no. They said that since becoming a shochet, the ritual slaughterer of Gore, Reb Gedalia had never once found any beast unclean. Whenever the question arose, he ruled the beast clean, and he abandoned all the laws of purity. He permitted the women to go to the bathhouse and then to bed with their husbands soon after menstruation. According to him, they did not have to keep the additional 7 days of abstinence. He explained to young matrons ways to inflame their husbands and whispered in their ears that ever since Shabtai Tzvi had been revealed, the commandment against adultery was void. It was rumored that young men were exchanging wives, and they were committing pederasty with one another and sodomy with their goats. I will spare you many of these details. But the debauchery of Gore is unstoppable. And as the predicted day of redemption approaches, people stop preparing for the winter that lies ahead. There's no longer any point in patiently working for the mundane tomorrow if something infinitely better lies ahead. And when the cold season comes, as it inevitably does, there is no food or firewood because people have not made their preparations. And suddenly, the news comes that Shabtai Tzvi has converted to Islam. Instead of redemption, the town is left in even greater ruin, much greater ruin than it was after the pogroms. And suddenly we see that the whole story of the Ukrainian pogroms was more or less background for the real tragedy that comes with the letting go of patient responsibility for everyday life. Now, Singer concludes this book in an old-fashioned way as if it were meant to teach us a simple lesson, warning, let none attempt to force the Lord to end pain within the world. The Messiah will come in God's own time and free men of despair and crime. But if Banish could not so easily restore Jewish civilization to his town, we cannot fully trust this neat little restorative sermon. Singer has found a way of eating his cake and having it too, of bringing pornography into Yiddish literature under the guise of coming out against it. And this was his technique, of course, always. But we're really not sure what part of modernity he's warning us against: the sexual revolution, political demagogues, letting go of Judaism, or the ruinous movements of right and left. But though I don't suggest that we read this book as an allegory, I find it a strong cautionary tale about the allure of hope and change. Jews as a political minority are not likely to turn murderous like the marauding peasants at the start of the novel, but we are certainly susceptible to frenzies of self-delusion. Jews as a people do not rush dangerously into imperial wars. We rush dangerously into messianic visions of peace. And I would say that so I don't have to say that this is the book that got me through the Oslo Accords. So what about Zionism, the most enduring political legacy of the 1930s? Did our best writers have anything to say about that? Now, the years 1933 to 36 are known as the period of the Fifth Aliyah, when over 170,000 European Jews immigrated to Palestine. The Hebrew writer Shmuel Yosef Agnon had come on Aliyah much earlier, and he was by then living in Jerusalem, so one might have expected him to write about the young pioneers who were then building the infrastructure of the emerging Jewish state. Jews were erecting settlements in the Galilee and in the south. The Yishuv was defending itself from the Arabs and the British while resettling those who were coming from Europe. It was an extraordinary time, a time of steel. I mean, that generation, we will never be able to praise highly enough. And Agnon was an active participant in that pioneering movement, and he was already acknowledged to be the greatest writer of modern Hebrew fiction. So indeed, he then wrote a novel of Aliyah, a slim little book called In the Heart of Seas, Bilvav Yamim, that appeared in 1934. However, it was not at all the book that one might have expected. In the Heart of Seas tells of a group of Jews, 10 men, 7 women, who move from Buchach, Agnon's native town, to Jerusalem. But the book is situated a century earlier, in the 1830s. The persons making Aliyah in this book are pious Jews, most of them past middle age. They are accompanied by a mysterious character, Hananiah, beloved or gift of God, who is both earthly and slightly supernatural. The story describes the real difficulties the travelers face at every step of the way. They are cheated by innkeepers, bitten by swarms of mosquitoes, almost drowned in a storm at sea. They are riddled by doubts and insecurities. While the Buchach Jews manage the hard journey by land and sea, Hananiah reaches the land of Israel flying on his handkerchief. The writing is steeped in Talmudic references. It resonates with biblical quotations and evokes Jewish historical parallels. Almost every noun can be understood both literally and allegorically or metaphorically. Almost every statement is complicated by a counter-reference. Agnon defies our expectations of the forward-looking, pioneering Zionist narrative by giving us an eternally anxious story of the Jewish people, a story that fuses past and present attachment to Zion, that fuses practical and metaphysical ways of reaching the homeland. Theodor Herzl had laid down a blueprint for the actual recovery of Palestine to show that it could be done. When Herzl wrote The Old New Land, Alt-Neuland, he wanted to reassure the Jews that they would be able to enjoy in the restored homeland all the amenities of their cafes in Vienna. Agnon's novella is a mild corrective to this approach. Zionism in this story is not some brand new political invention. One of Agnon's travelers, Rabbi Meir, divorced his wife because she refused to go up with him to the land of Israel. In an attempt to make Rabbi Meir reconsider, her father offers to double her dowry if only he will stay with her in Buchach. And Rabbi Meir replies, I have already contracted with another bride, and I cannot shame her. So Aliyah for Agnon is reunion with our promised bride. Herzl described an ideal Jewish country of the future and explained how it would achieve its perfection. Not so the novel by Agnon. When Agnon's travelers reach Jerusalem, they find conditions that are not much better than the harsh ones of their journey. Arab enmity, poverty, centuries of neglect. Jerusalem is anything but a panacea. But Hanania accompanies the travelers to remind them and us that theirs is not merely a horizontal journey or a search for political haven, though it is certainly that. It's not merely driven by anti-Semitism. It's the culmination of an eternal longing and a step in the fulfillment of a divine plan. Inspiration in this novel comes from being part of that magnificent national design. The individual finds his splendor in that design. So these three books, these three little works, throb with the urgency that drove their authors to write them. Babel in Soviet uniform sees that there is no longer any chance of escaping the responsibilities of power. We may mourn the lost innocence. We have a right to mourn that lost innocence, but enmity is not our choice. We can only choose our response. Basheva Singer in Poland feels the temptation of a world that wants to free us from all repression. Who wants the hard lifting of Jewish law when you can indulge your appetites because the rules no longer apply? Who wants conservative values and civilizing practices if you can throw off all the outdated, restrictive, and inhibiting rules? Singer goes beyond realism to dramatize the fatal consequences of investing intemperate faith in the wrong ideas. But then some might say, what about Zionism? Wasn't that a movement of secular liberation that held out promise for the political future? Agnon says, not quite. Recovery of national sovereignty was the obligatory stage in a process that began at the beginnings of the Jewish people and must therefore integrate and perpetuate everything valuable of the past. Agnon's travelers are first and foremost good Jews who fulfill the requirements of the commandments by repopulating the land of Israel. Over and above realpolitik, they remember that the sanctity of Israel is guided by a higher hand. Great literature should not and cannot be reduced to homiletic lessons. And I'm not proposing that, I hope you understand, but I do hear these works urging the Jewish people to take responsibility for our new status as a politically sovereign people. Each book in its way demonstrates that from here on in, all the responsibility is ours. There is not a shred of Jewish self-pity in these stories, nor for all their anxiety is there a tone of despair. The title of Agnon's book is taken from the book of Jonah, who prays from the belly of the fish, "In my trouble I called to the Lord. You cast me into the depths, into the heart of seas. Yet you brought my life up from the pit." Agnon reminds us of the ultimate source of Jewish national life. So ours is a sober history and a sober present. But as you see, we are learning to raise our own national life up from the pit. These works from 1932, 33, 34 have as much to say to us now as they ever did. But at the same time, as we look around us, and especially as we look around us here today, I think we can also see how far we have come. Thank you.